Some families are remembered for wealth, some for power, and some for the dark stains they leave on history. Behind the grand estates and family crests, there are legacies carved not in honor, but in blood, secrets, and shadows. Tonight, we descend into the story of one such family, whose name carried whispers of curses, hauntings, and unspeakable acts. This is not just a tale of history, it's a descent into the horrific legacy that refuses to die. The origin of the curse tied to the Duskmoor family is a tale whispered in fragments, often half-believed, yet so persistent across centuries that it refuses to fade. It is said to have begun in the late 17th century, when the Duskmoor name was still one of rising fortune and ambition. At that time, they were not yet cloaked in infamy, but rather admired for their landholdings, their wealth in trade, and their ability to weave themselves into the threads of power. The patriarch of the time, Alaric Duskmoor, was known as a man who would go to extraordinary lengths to secure his family's prominence, and in his relentless pursuit of power, he stumbled upon paths best left untrodden. According to crumbling parish records and murmured accounts that never found their way into official archives, Alaric's rise coincided with a series of events that defied explanation. The estate lands, which the Duskmoors had only recently claimed, were themselves steeped in older legends. Before the Duskmoors took possession, locals whispered that the grounds were once home to an ancient burial site, a place avoided even by shepherds who guided their flocks across the hills. Strange fires were said to flicker there in the dead of night, and travelers swore they heard chanting rising from the earth itself. Alaric, however, was a man uninterested in the superstitions of common folk. He built upon those very grounds, raising a grand hall whose foundations seemed to drink in the whispers of the land. It was within those walls that the curse is said to have first taken root. The story most often told is that Alaric sought not only political influence but also longevity, a way to extend his years beyond what nature would grant. He invited into his home a series of peculiar guests, men and women from foreign lands who spoke of hidden arts and forbidden practices. Neighbors noticed lights glowing from the manor's windows until the early hours of the morning, and servants who once worked within refused to speak of what they had seen. Yet a pattern began to emerge in the village below. Animals were found mutilated on the outskirts of the estate, their remains arranged in grotesque symbols carved into the earth. Crops nearest to the Duskmoor lands withered inexplicably, while those farther away flourished untouched. Families who had lived peacefully for generations began to report sudden illnesses, nightmares that plagued entire households, and children who woke screaming in the night, claiming to see figures standing at their windows. It was not long before tragedy struck within the Duskmoor line itself. Alaric's eldest son, Tobias, fell from a great height within the manor, though no one could explain what he had been doing in the rafters. His death was ruled an accident, but servants whispered of shadows moving on their own, of Tobias walking the halls in confusion days before his fall, as if something unseen pulled at his mind. Soon after, Alaric's wife, Helena, was found lifeless in her chambers, her face frozen in an expression of unutterable terror. No doctor could explain the cause, for there were no wounds, no sickness that could be named. Only her eyes, wide and glassy, told of something seen in her final moments that the living were never meant to behold. From these tragedies, the idea of a curse was born, but the family's connection to it seemed almost willful. Instead of retreating from the practices whispered about in hushed tones, Alaric leaned deeper into them. The estate became a place avoided by all but the boldest, and those who did wander too close often claimed to feel an oppressive weight settle over them, as though the very air resisted their presence. Visitors spoke of hearing their own names whispered in the wind, of seeing fleeting shapes reflected in the manor's tall windows, shapes that bore no resemblance to those inside. Parish priests attempted blessings of the grounds, yet the efforts ended abruptly when one of them collapsed mid-prayer, struck by an ailment that left him unable to speak for the remainder of his days. As the years unfolded, the tales multiplied. Alaric himself seemed untouched by age, even as his peers withered, his hair remaining dark and his posture unbent, though his eyes grew hollow and sunken, like a man carrying unbearable weight. The villagers who still worked the lands noticed that storms gathered more frequently over the Duskmoor estate, lightning striking near its spires again and again as if drawn to it. When asked about it, Alaric gave no explanation, and those who pressed too hard on the subject found themselves facing misfortune soon after. Some lost their livestock overnight, others their homes to fire, and a few were never seen again. Generations later, descendants of the Duskmoor family would inherit not only the manor but also the whispers of the curse that began with Alaric. Each retelling added another layer of dread, and though historians tried to dismiss the accounts as folklore, the string of inexplicable deaths and tragedies connected to the family was difficult to ignore. The notion that the Duskmoors had bound themselves, willingly or not, to something darker than themselves became an accepted truth in the minds of the local people. Children were warned never to play near the estate, and travellers were told to avoid the grounds, for to cross the Duskmoor land was to court misfortune. Even now, long after the family's power has faded, the idea persists that their legacy began not with honour or fortune, but with a bargain struck in shadows, a bargain whose price would echo through bloodlines and across centuries, leaving behind a stain that time itself could not wash away. The whispers of forbidden rituals surrounding the Duskmoor family have remained some of the most disturbing fragments of their legacy, stories passed down through hushed voices and fragmented accounts that seem too strange, too ghastly, to dismiss as mere rumour. Unlike the tragedies that marked their household and the visible misfortunes that befell them, these accounts venture into darker territory, speaking of deliberate acts carried out under moonlight, far from the prying eyes of the village, rituals that blurred the lines between superstition and unholy devotion. The earliest accounts began in the aftermath of the deaths that struck Alaric Duskmoor's immediate kin, when villagers reported strange gatherings near the old woods that bordered the estate. On nights when the moon was shrouded by clouds, fires were seen flickering through the trees, not the warm orange glow of hearth or torch, but flames that shifted unnaturally between colours, as though feeding on something beyond wood and oil. Those who claimed to have stumbled too close to these gatherings told of rhythmic chants echoing through the forest, voices rising and falling in cadences foreign to any known tongue. Some said they saw figures cloaked in heavy garments, their faces hidden, moving in a circle as if bound by some invisible order. Others swore they saw animals brought to the center of these gatherings, their cries piercing the night before being silenced. The next morning, mutilated remains were often discovered at the edge of the woods, carefully arranged in patterns that no farmer or hunter could explain. The shapes were sometimes carved into the soil, sometimes hung from the low branches of trees, as though meant for an audience that no one living dared name. The estate itself seemed to take part in these practices, for servants spoke of certain rooms sealed from ordinary use, chambers with windows blackened and doors reinforced with heavy locks. One chamber, referred to only as the Red Room, was whispered to contain markings on the walls that no amount of scrubbing could erase, symbols burned into the stone itself. Those unlucky enough to be sent there for cleaning or errands often returned pale, shaken, claiming they felt unseen eyes watching them even when they stood alone. One maid, whose testimony appeared briefly in local records before disappearing altogether, claimed she found the master of the house standing in that room before dawn, speaking in a language she had never heard, his voice layered as if more than one person spoke through him. Generations after Alaric, the rituals did not vanish but evolved, passing like a dark inheritance through bloodlines. His grandson, Elias Duskmoor, was rumoured to have taken the practices to greater extremes. He was described as a man consumed with knowledge, collecting grim tomes from across Europe, many of which bore reputations so dark they were banned by church and state alike. These books, bound in leather, cracked and darkened with age, were said to contain invocations, diagrams of circles, and descriptions of rites meant to call upon entities older than mankind itself. Elias was often seen disappearing into the woods with these volumes in hand, accompanied by a small group of confidants who were never identified by name. Villagers swore that on those nights the animals of the region grew restless, dogs howled in unison, and cattle broke from their pens as if fleeing from something unseen. One particular story, often told by those who preserved these whispers, describes a harvest festival in which the villagers awoke to find that every scarecrow in the surrounding fields had been dismembered during the night, their straw guts spilling into the soil. At first it was dismissed as a cruel prank, but when farmers looked closer, they found the remains of crows nailed to the wooden posts, their wings spread in grotesque mimicry of crucifixion. At the center of one field stood a crude altar of stone that had not been there the day before, slick with a dark substance that no one dared test. The villagers suspected Elias and his circle, but fear of reprisal kept their accusations to whispers. Soon after, a string of illnesses swept through the village, taking the youngest and the frailest, while the Duskmoor household remained untouched, fueling speculation that these rituals were not acts of madness alone, but exchanges, dark bargains struck at the expense of others. The most unnerving detail in the legacy of these forbidden practices is the suggestion that they were not confined to the distant past but continued for generations, each new heir weaving them into the fabric of their lives. Diaries salvaged from the ruins of the estate, though fragmented, reveal mentions of gatherings referred to only as the communion, events held in secret where blood was exchanged and oaths renewed. Some entries speak of shadows taking form within the great hall, of candles burning without flame, and of voices whispering from the very walls. The words are fragmented, torn by time and fire, but the intent is clear enough. These rituals were not abandoned, and they bound the family in ways that ordinary inheritance never could. Even in later centuries, when the Duskmoors sought to maintain appearances of civility and respectability, the signs of these practices lingered. Guests invited to the estate for banquets reported feeling uneasy in certain corridors, their lamps flickering as though the air itself rejected light. Some spoke of seeing strange carvings hidden beneath rugs or concealed behind tapestries, markings that resembled those described in earlier accounts of the forest gatherings. When questioned, the hosts laughed it off as old superstition, remnants of ancestral eccentricity, but the tension in their voices betrayed something more deliberate, something preserved across time. Over the years, historians attempting to reconstruct the truth behind these accounts have faced missing records, destroyed letters, and archives suspiciously incomplete whenever the Duskmoor name is involved. Yet the persistence of these stories, scattered across centuries, across witnesses who never knew one another, lends them a weight difficult to dismiss. The idea of forbidden rituals within the Duskmoor estate is not tied to a single tale, but woven into a tapestry of collective memory, passed from generation to generation like an unshakable shadow. Whether they were true acts of summoning or the desperate attempts of a family clinging to unnatural power, the result was the same. The Duskmoor name became synonymous with hidden rites, the kind that turned the air cold and left the land itself scarred, the kind of practices that left their estate forever marked as a place where the ordinary laws of nature bent and buckled under the weight of something far darker. The bloodlines of madness that plagued the Duskmoor family became as much a part of their legacy as their wealth and influence, for no generation seemed untouched by affliction. What began with whispers of a curse in Alaric's time grew into a pattern too consistent to dismiss, a sequence of behaviors and tragedies that left neighbors convinced that insanity had seeped into their blood itself. The Duskmoor lineage was marked by a peculiar brand of mental unraveling, not always immediate, but inevitable, manifesting in ways both subtle and catastrophic. Some descended slowly, their minds clouded by visions they could not explain, while others fell quickly, consumed by paranoia and violent obsessions that ended in ruin. It was often said that madness first showed its face in Tobias, the son who fell to his death within the rafters of the manor. Servants recounted that in the weeks leading up to the accident, he spoke of figures only he could see, drifting at the edges of the hallways, following him no matter where he went. He was found at night wandering in a trance-like state, muttering names that no one recognized. Some claimed that he began speaking in voices not his own, one moment his usual tone, the next something deeper, harsher, as though an intruder had lodged itself within him. Though his fall was explained away as mischance, those who knew him were certain he had been driven into a frenzy by visions that pulled him upward, into the heights of the house where shadows pooled like water. In the following generations, the affliction deepened. Elias Duskmoor, known for his obsession with forbidden books and unholy gatherings, was described by visitors as a man possessed by knowledge beyond his capacity to bear. His journals, when later discovered, painted a portrait of a mind torn between brilliance and despair. Pages filled with detailed diagrams and incantations abruptly gave way to erratic scrawls, words written backward, passages crossed out and rewritten dozens of times as though he could never silence the voices that dictated them. In his later years, Elias rarely appeared in public, and when he did, he was gaunt and trembling, his eyes darting as if tracking things invisible to others. His decline was marked by sudden bursts of violence. Servants spoke of him attacking mirrors, smashing them with fists until his hands bled, screaming that the reflections were mocking him. Other members of the family displayed madness in quieter but no less terrifying forms. Helena Duskmoor, a descendant 2 generations later, was said to have lived in constant dread of her own reflection. She ordered nearly every mirror removed from the manor, claiming that faces not her own stared back at her from the glass. Those who visited described her speaking in riddles, her conversations circling endlessly until they collapsed into laughter that chilled those present. When she died, her chambers were found to be covered in frantic writings scrawled upon the walls, hundreds of repetitions of the phrase "they are waiting," though no one ever learned who she meant. The most infamous of the afflicted was Jonathan Duskmoor in the 19th century, whose madness spilled far beyond the confines of the estate. He became convinced that he was pursued by shadows cast not by light, but by memory. Figures he claimed were the ancestors themselves returned to demand a debt unpaid. His paranoia led him to seal entire wings of the manor, declaring them unfit for human presence. He forbade his servants from entering certain rooms, and when one disobeyed, the man was found days later, wandering the grounds in silence, unable to speak of what he had seen. Jonathan's decline ended violently, for he barricaded himself inside the Red Room and set fire to it, his screams echoing through the house until the blaze consumed him. When the flames were extinguished, little remained but charred stone and ash, yet his death did nothing to end the pattern of madness that haunted those who followed. The locals, observing generation after generation fall prey to such horrors, grew convinced that insanity was not merely a misfortune of the Duskmoors, but the inevitable consequence of their bloodline. The family's pursuit of unnatural power, their rituals and their bargains were believed to have poisoned their very lineage, ensuring that no heir could escape the shadow that consumed the others. The curse was seen not as a single event, but as a living thing that bred within them, passed down as surely as their wealth or their name. This belief was strengthened by the uncanny similarities in the family's afflictions, visions of unseen watchers, voices whispering in the night, an obsession with reflections and shadows, and a descent into self-destruction that seemed scripted, as though each heir acted out the same role across centuries. Even when some members of the family attempted to distance themselves from the estate and its legacy, the madness followed. Letters from distant relatives tell of nights filled with dreams so vivid they left physical marks on the skin, scratches and bruises, with no earthly explanation. One descendant who settled far from the manor wrote that she awoke nightly to the sensation of hands pressing down upon her chest, leaving her gasping for air. Though she had never stepped foot on the Duskmoor grounds, she believed the curse travelled with her blood, a tether that could not be severed by distance or denial. The madness of the Duskmoor family became, over time, their defining characteristic in the eyes of outsiders. Neighbours regarded them with a mixture of fear and pity, unsure whether they were victims of their own ancestors' choices or willing participants in a cycle that could not be broken. Some scholars tried to frame the tales as a record of hereditary illness, a lineage plagued by some form of inherited condition, but the sheer consistency of the symptoms, their alignment with supernatural themes, and the way they always mirrored the family's darker practices made this explanation difficult to accept fully. To those who lived in the shadow of the manor, the madness was not illness, but punishment, a visible sign of the family's pact with something they could never control. The bloodlines of madness ensured that the Duskmoor family could never truly escape the horror that defined them. Each generation became another link in a chain forged in shadows, a pattern of descent that repeated itself endlessly, leaving a legacy of shattered minds, haunted lives, and deaths that seemed less like accidents and more like the inevitable conclusion of a story written long before they were born. The vanishing heirs of the Duskmoor family became one of the most enduring and unsettling aspects of their legacy, for while madness and tragedy could at least be spoken of, disappearances left behind only silence and speculation. Across centuries, names recorded in family trees simply ended without explanation. Children who were born and lived long enough to be noted in baptismal records, yet whose deaths were never documented, whose graves were never found. The pattern began early, with the loss of Alaric's second son, Marcus, who was last seen playing near the edge of the woods that bordered the estate. His nurse claimed she had only turned her back for a moment, but when she looked again, the child was gone. Search parties scoured the grounds for days, lanterns swinging through the trees, dogs sniffing the undergrowth, yet not so much as a scrap of clothing was recovered. The boy's sudden disappearance left the family shaken, though Alaric himself spoke little of it, merely ordering that the woods never be entered by his household again after sundown. This was only the first of many vanishments that would haunt the Duskmoor line. In later years, other heirs vanished under circumstances no less strange. Some were children barely old enough to walk, while others were young adults preparing to inherit the responsibilities of the estate. What linked their disappearances was not only the absence of explanation, but the eerie signs that often accompanied them. Doors were found open, though they had been bolted. Footprints appeared in places no one should have tread, and on more than one occasion, voices were heard calling from empty rooms, voices eerily resembling those of the missing. Servants who witnessed these events often refused to remain in the household afterward, and the family was forced to replace its staff repeatedly as fear spread through those employed within the manor's walls. One of the most chilling accounts came from the disappearance of Clara Duskmoor in the 18th century. She was described as a spirited young woman, fond of walking the gardens and reading by candlelight. On the night she vanished, a storm lashed the estate, rain hammering against the glass and wind rattling the shutters. Servants later testified that they heard Clara's voice in the hallway calling for her mother, though when they opened their doors to investigate, the corridor was empty. The following morning her bed was untouched, her chamber door still locked from the inside, yet Clara herself was gone. On the wall above her bed, carved deeply into the wood, was a phrase none could explain: "Taken back." The handwriting was not hers, and no tool sharp enough to leave such marks was ever found. Centuries later, similar disappearances occurred even as the estate aged and the family dwindled in number. Jonathan Duskmoor's twin sons, Edwin and Henry, vanished within a year of each other, both on nights of the new moon. Edwin was last seen tending to the stables, and when the servants went to fetch him, the stable was silent, the lantern extinguished, the horses restless as though they had seen something unnatural. Henry's disappearance followed in almost the same manner, this time from the library, where a book lay open on the desk, its ink smudged as though he had been interrupted mid-sentence. Their father refused to speak of their loss, and though villagers pressed for an explanation, none was given. The twins' absence left the estate eerily quiet. Corridors that once echoed with their voices now filled only with whispers and footsteps that servants swore belonged to no living soul. The most disturbing detail of these vanishings was that they rarely seemed to end with the act of disappearance. Often, after an heir was gone, strange manifestations plagued the household. Crying voices were heard at night, sometimes recognized as the missing child, sometimes distorted into something unearthly. Rooms where the vanished once slept grew inexplicably cold, candles refusing to stay lit, and objects shifting of their own accord. Family members left behind were tormented by dreams in which the missing returned, their faces pale and eyes hollow, begging to be let back in. Some wrote of shadows gathering in corners, tall and shapeless, standing watch where the children once played. It was as if the heirs were not simply gone, but claimed by something unseen, something that lingered to remind the family of what it had taken. Villagers surrounding the estate developed their own explanations for the disappearances. Some believed the family's ancestors demanded sacrifices to preserve the wealth and unnatural longevity that seemed to cling to certain Duskmoors. Others whispered that the estate itself, built upon cursed land, consumed the heirs as payment for the arrogance of raising walls upon ground meant for the dead. Stories circulated of hidden passages beneath the manor, tunnels that led into the earth where the missing were kept, their voices carried upward through the stone. No one ever proved such tunnels existed, though later excavations uncovered strange hollows beneath the foundations, spaces carved into unnatural shapes and too symmetrical to be natural. What deepened the mystery was the silence of the family themselves. Rarely did they speak of their vanished kin, as if acknowledging the disappearances might invite more. Family portraits were altered, figures painted out or left unfinished, as though the missing had never existed at all. Genealogical records were equally strange, names abruptly ending without death dates, as though those who kept them wished to preserve the gaps rather than explain them. This silence became as much a part of the legend as the disappearances themselves, an unspoken rule that the heirs who were taken were not to be mourned, only forgotten, though their presence lingered all the same. Even in the family's decline, when the estate fell into ruin and only a few distant relatives remained, the pattern did not end. Travelers passing near the grounds in the late 19th century reported hearing children's laughter carried on the wind, though no children lived there anymore. Some swore they saw small figures darting among the trees, vanishing when pursued, while others described glimpses of pale faces staring from cracked windows of the abandoned manor. To this day, those who know the history of the Duskmoor family believe that not all of their heirs ever truly left the estate, that their vanishings were not disappearances in the mortal sense, but something darker, a claiming of flesh and blood that bound the family's legacy not to life, but to whatever force haunted their line from the very beginning. The legacy that haunts the Duskmoor family is not confined to their lifetimes or even to the crumbling stones of their estate, but lingers in the imagination of all who have ever come near their story, shaping itself into folklore, warnings, and nightmares passed through generations. Unlike ordinary tales of noble families who rose and fell with time, the Duskmoor name never faded entirely, for the weight of their tragedies and the strangeness of their history refused to rest in the ground. To this day, the very mention of their name carries a shiver, as though it summons not only memory but the shadows that memory conceals. The haunting of their legacy is not just about ghosts or vanished heirs, but about how the darkness of one family seemed to stain everything around it, turning a place into a wound on the land and a story into a curse that refuses to end. Locals long believed that the estate itself was alive in some dreadful way, an extension of the family's tormented soul. Visitors reported that its halls seemed to breathe, that silence pressed down upon intruders until it became unbearable, that doors opened and closed without touch. Even after the last Duskmoor descendant abandoned the house, villagers swore the windows glowed faintly at night, as though fires still burned within, as though banquets were still being held for guests unseen. Those who dared enter in later years came out shaken, describing the scent of extinguished candles and the faint echo of footsteps on staircases that should have been empty. Some claimed to see figures in the corners of their vision, dressed in the fashions of centuries past, standing utterly still until they vanished when approached. The belief took hold that the Duskmoors themselves had never truly left, that the sins and secrets of the family had tied their spirits to the estate for eternity. But the haunting legacy extended far beyond the crumbling manor. The surrounding villages carried the burden of the family's story in their own way, shaping their traditions around avoidance and caution. Children were warned not to wander near the estate, not only out of fear of danger, but because it was said the land itself could claim those who lingered too long. Farmers who worked fields nearby muttered prayers as they tilled the soil, convinced that the earth remembered the blood spilled in rituals long ago. At night, families barred their shutters tightly, for some swore that on certain evenings a knocking sound could be heard at doors and windows, always in threes, and if opened, nothing was there except a chill that swept through the home. The villagers said these were the heirs returning, not in body but in shadow, searching for companions to join them in whatever place they had been taken. Stories persisted that anyone who meddled too closely in the affairs of the Duskmoor past would be cursed themselves. Scholars who tried to study the family's records often met with uncanny misfortunes. One researcher in the early 20th century, who had compiled a detailed genealogy of the family, was found drowned in a shallow stream, though no explanation for how he came to be there was ever given. Another, who had tried to publish fragments of Elias Duskmoor's journals, vanished during a trip to the estate ruins, his belongings found neatly arranged in one of the abandoned chambers, but with no sign of his body. These tales reinforced the belief that the Duskmoor story was not to be investigated too closely, that the very act of uncovering their history risked drawing the same shadows that had consumed the family itself. Folklore surrounding the Duskmoors also became entangled with the landscape, shaping the identity of the entire region. There are still tales of a figure in black seen wandering the forest paths on nights of the new moon, said to be Alaric himself, searching endlessly for the heirs he lost to the curse. Travelers spoke of hearing whispers urging them to turn back, voices that grew louder the closer they came to the ruins of the estate. Some even claimed that the land resisted attempts to erase the memory of the family. Efforts to rebuild upon the site failed repeatedly, with structures collapsing, fires breaking out, or workers abandoning the project after reporting nightmares too vivid to endure. It seemed as though the very soil refused to release the Duskmoor name, binding it into the geography as deeply as roots. The haunting legacy also existed in the minds of those who bore the name but lived far from the estate. Distant descendants who carried the blood of the Duskmoors found themselves haunted by dreams, visions of halls they had never entered, and faces they had never seen. Letters preserved in archives describe these descendants waking in terror, convinced that hands had gripped them during sleep or that someone had been whispering in their ear. Even those who denied any belief in curses could not shake the sense that their lineage carried something unnatural, a burden that followed them across oceans and through centuries. Some went so far as to change their names entirely, abandoning the Duskmoor heritage, yet the stories always seemed to catch up with them, and their lives often ended with the same misfortunes that plagued their ancestors. The legacy of the Duskmoor family thus became less about individuals and more about a pattern, a cycle that repeated endlessly regardless of time or distance. Madness, vanishings, and hauntings became inseparable from their name, as though the family had entered into a pact not only with darkness, but with memory itself. No attempt to bury their story ever succeeded, for each disappearance, each tragedy, each whispered ritual gave rise to another tale that spread beyond the estate walls. The Duskmoor name transformed into a warning spoken by elders to children, a reminder of what happens when ambition and obsession trespass into realms better left untouched. The haunting is not confined to ghosts wandering old corridors, but to the way their story lingers in the imagination of all who hear it, refusing to die, demanding to be retold, each retelling breathing life back into the curse that began centuries ago and continues to echo even now.